Hello, this is JFL, John Francis Leader, and welcome to the Body, Mind, Self podcast. So my guest today is Professor Aljosa Smolic. You're very welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here. And I should say thank you for having me, because we're here in your building recording this, and a hell of a building it is too. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. I was introduced to your work a while ago by Dr. A.B. Campbell over in UCD, who spoke highly of some of the work you were doing. And given that you do interesting work, and you also happen to be based in Dublin at the moment, we couldn't miss the opportunity to have a good chat. So for anybody who doesn't know you, doesn't know your work, how would you introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do? What excites you?
Well, I do research in visual computing, so processing of any type of visual information from camera to display. So capturing real-world scenarios with cameras and other types of sensors, converting them into other types of representations, and in the end making nice-looking images as part of some creative content. So it's mostly tools for content creators, for, as I said, any type of visual information. And things that we are currently most interested in are augmented reality, virtual reality, things that are considered as immersive technologies that are coming to everyone's life very soon.
Right, so right. And it seems to be an interesting time, because I would think that, go back 10 years, maybe go back 20 years, keep going back, that fewer people would have really got what you do. I'm sure they still don't understand what you do if you stop a person on the street. But the types of technologies you mentioned seem to be more in the public consciousness more. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, definitely. So things that I've been doing were always around video, around visual information. So everyone knows video, and you can explain everyone that you are processing video to some extent.
Yeah,
so it was not something like astrophysics, where you are very far away from understanding of the lay people. So I always had the pleasure that I could explain my research very well to everyone, and also show nice demos and our presentations be very, very visual. But you're right that specific aspects of what I've been doing already 15 years ago in augmented reality, virtual reality, and things we call free viewpoint video, were really pioneering back then. And I've been active in this over many years and built a reputation and the background in that, in the scientific side. And many of this is just right now on the cusp of becoming mainstream. So people get more and more familiar with virtual reality and headsets that they are putting and being immersed into such environments. But also augmented reality is something that really everyone will understand very soon, as we will have it all on our phones very, very soon. And it means like the seamless overlay and integration of real world and virtual elements in some visual environment, like having on your phone some information overlaid about the environment you are in is a simple example, and that will be on everyone's phone very soon. So the big companies like Apple and Google, Facebook, they are investing very much in that, and everyone will have an understanding of that very soon, and very many use cases.
And what have been the implications over the past number of years of that growing awareness of these technologies? Has that changed what you're doing much? Because as you said, you've been doing this for quite some time, but what has been the effect of that?
I mean, we have been doing this 15 years ago, and we were doing prototypes that showed partially the functionality of what we also do today. But the technology itself was still so crappy or so immature, right? That you could not convince everyone from the market or the business or the end user qualities of that.
Right.
But now with the headsets becoming really good, and everyone having a small computer in his pocket, all of this becomes suddenly accessible. So that then raises a lot of hype in the industry, a lot of expectation among the users, and an atmosphere where really something is happening. And we are just right in the middle and in the right place of having all this background and knowledge to contribute to that at this point in time. So it's an exciting time, I must say. So we get so many contacts and interest for what we are doing, that we just can't do everything that we could do, or where we have ideas from.
Yeah, and I can see that there's potentially so many different applications for what you're doing and different types of technologies, and the old divides between one technology and another seem to be disappearing dramatically. You know, the obvious go-to examples are things like smartphones, where you would have, you know, years ago, separate photography specialists and separate, you know, communication specialists, and all of a sudden now cameras are phones and phones are cameras, and all of a sudden there's this sort of emerging going on. What's that been like for you existentially over the past while? Did you, a long time ago, see the potential for all these things to be kind of unified together, or do the categories that you work with chop and change over time as you think about them?
Yeah, they do change and they evolve, and not everything I would have foreseen like this. So especially the possibilities we have with the mobile devices today, I didn't have that in mind 10, 15 years ago, that the hardware would be so accessible and so available. As you say, everyone has a full computer that is more powerful than the NASA computers that were controlling the rockets going to the moon in our pockets. But in the core of the technology and the vision of the applications, that was something that we had in mind. So we were thinking of putting virtual elements into real environments, or glasses-based systems where you could see through and have information overlaid and integrate real and virtual things. But to which extent and how exactly that would surface in the market, well, not all the details were clear to me at that point in time. But it was also something more abstract, and that could apply to different use cases, and that's what we see happening today.
Yeah, and that universal core that you're talking about there seems to be an important point, because I noticed in your title, Professor of Creative Technology. So there's two interesting words coming together, technology and creativity. And, you know, whether you're talking about etchings on cave walls or whether you're talking about modern smart technologies, there seems to be some sense in which we're bringing a creativity to the table, but also we're using technology, whether it's as simple as a stick in the sand to, you know, draw a picture, or whether it's very sophisticated immersive systems, we're using that to kind of supplement and augment, as you say too. So it's interesting that you say that, because it does seem that although the fashion of the technology may change and the way we splice and subdivide technologies may change, it does seem to be that there is a core theme which is not just there over the past few decades, but is probably a universal theme that has always and will always be there. Has that theme, I don't know, has it always been clear to you, or have you come to see that more over time? What do you think?
One aspect of what you just mentioned became very clear to me over the last 2-3 years, when this hype around virtual reality started a lot. Because in the end, it goes back to storytelling. If creative things are about storytelling, about characters, about emotions, about conveying something in between humans that tells a story, and that goes back to sitting at the bonfire together and the storyteller telling things from his life, and the whole tribe sitting and listening, to painting on the walls, which is a first level maybe of expression, or building first artifacts out of wood or whatever they did back. But it is still the same thing of wanting to tell stories, and the elements of that are the same. So it's characters, it is things that happen, and it's tragedy, it's fun. So there's a couple of basic things you can tell, and humans still also do the same things they did a few thousand years ago. But as you say, the technologies change and the opportunities change, and then later we had film. 2D film, where you go into a cinema, as an example, right? And there is a director that selects a couple of visual scenes that he puts together in a way that it would tell a story and convey an emotion. And there is a certain language developed in filmmaking, how to tell, for instance, an over-shoulder shot or things, and also the technology around it, where to place a scenery and how to frame pictures. All of that has been developed with the focus of that medium, which was film. That was also fully immersive if you put yourself into a cinema and let yourself go into the movie. Also, reading a book is fully immersive now, although it doesn't have any of the technologies that we today speak about as immersive technologies like VR. So that thinking around such things gave me this well, for me personally, the insight that is not new, that it's a storytelling, and we are evolving new tools, we are creating new technologies that put the creatives into the position to tell their stories and create new aesthetics and all of this around. And this then later evolved when I started, again, we're looking very much into virtual reality, where we try to find out how storytelling is new in virtual reality compared to classical filmmaking. I was also, as I had an appointment at the School of Arts in Karlsruhe as a kind of honorary professor. I gave a course there with a group of students on immersive storytelling, but immersive in a sense, in virtual reality, because classical language of filmmaking doesn't work. So you don't have the over-shoulder, the cut from one to the other to convey a dialogue as a classical filmmaker would do it. So you put the camera into the scene. So it's unclear how you would do these things in virtual reality. It's also unclear how you would use lighting, how you would cut from one scene to the other, because that means basically teleporting the audience from one scene to the other. And also very trivial things, so there's no behind the scenes. So where do you put the crew? Where do you put the microphones? So from very practical, technical things to very sophisticated storyline considerations, all of this is actually unknown. And so in the course of this seminar, we evolved that and talked about, well, what's actually new and what were the old things from filmmaking that we can use, which do we need to restructure, redefine, or what can we learn from gaming?
Yes.
So this all is an example of this, what I wanted to say, that it's storytelling, and we are, as creative technologists, we are looking at which technologies can we provide to storytellers in the end.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because some of the language of things like filmmaking is, if we take cinema as a classic example, which is interesting because it's relatively new, but still old enough for us to have developed a good language of how we consider it. Some of it is given. I mean, even the duration of a film has a lot to do with the human bladder and attention spans and things like that. So there are practical limitations, but some of it seems to be a language that we've learned as well. We've kind of learned how to watch film over time as well. What's interesting about, I suppose, the likes of virtual reality narrative is that not only do we not know how to make it, but we I suppose haven't learned the language yet. It's a little bit like the example of, do the orange juice manufacturers make the cartons to fit the fridge, or do the fridge manufacturers make the fridges to fit the cartons? And you can presume there's been kind of a dance there over time in some way. So I suppose if we're a director or a writer, we're thinking about the expectations of our audience to some degree and their familiarity with the technology as we create. But meanwhile, of course, the audience member is expecting a certain thing from the director or the writer as well. So it's new, I suppose, in some of these new approaches we're taking to narrative in the likes of virtual reality. Could you say some more about the implications of that, I suppose? Because do we have to learn how to consume this media to some degree?
Yes, absolutely. So and the duration is one example of that. So it's unclear if people will be willing or to stay in a virtual environment for longer than a few minutes. So certainly it's not the 90-minute narrative that will happen there. So we are still thinking, what is a good length, or how long is kind of something where a maximum acceptance of the audience would lie, right? So, and we are testing that also in some creative experiments, right? And part of our project is, we have nice funding for that as well, is to early on get together with creatives with some of our tools and give them things in the hand and use their creativity to come up with real use cases, creative pieces of our technology, where we could try out the technology but also really field test exactly such things. So for instance, one thing that we just recently did and that we will release in the Dublin Theatre Festival, for instance, is a play where we got together with the School of Drama of Trinity, and we captured a Samuel Beckett play that was made for stage. It was a very specific one of a quite short duration and a very limited geometry among the actors that are participating. And we created a virtual reality version of that.
Okay.
And now we have, I think it's one of the first things in the world where we can test and try out the audience and put them into a virtual reality theater play and see how they would react. Because these things that you mentioned are unknown, and everyone is experimenting like we are experimenting.
Yeah.
And the technology is just out there and starting to take traction, to get traction. And so we are very as curious as the creatives to learn about what the outcomes of that will be.
And I'm glad you used the word theater, because that does seem to be a good go-to source, doesn't it, for how to approach some of this. Yeah. We again, technologies become fashionable and sometimes just commercially useful. If you're a big corporation and you decide theater is the product, it gets a bit tricky. Of course, you can have shows, and there are big companies who do that, but it's not as packageable in some way. There's some sense of it being live and even interactive to some extent, but there's a lot to learn there, isn't there, in the use of some of what we're trying to do with VR or that type of application. Any thoughts on that? Because the project you describe is a good example of that. How to take maybe modern approaches to technology, but then to try and have conversations with more traditional forms like theater. Yes. How does that go?
So
What's that been like?
That was exactly something challenging. So we were a bit afraid of that specific example, but also that was an exciting element of that. Because Samuel Beckett is a very famous thing, and specifically at Trinity, he's a very highly regarded figure, obviously. And so we presented this at the Samuel Beckett Summer School in the summer, the first presentation of this project. And we were really a bit afraid of how the perception would be, as these people are very traditional, very from the theater space, from drama, how their perception would be taking that now to virtual reality and this kind of classical pieces in such a reinterpretation. And specifically the director from the School of Drama, who was in charge of the creative side, and also our creative director, Neil, were nervous how it would be perceived, but the perception was very good. So the feedback that we got from these people was very positive, very open, and kind of embracing this type of idea to see how classical drama would work with these technologies. So that made us confident to go on, and we are planning more collaborations with them, trying out other things also in augmented reality. There will be another project like this, and so we are going out with this piece, with the play also, and going to market that a lot. But also, as you mentioned, the big ones, also the big companies realized that this technology is out there, will be out there, but that there is a big content gap, and that people will need content to consume, otherwise the hardware and everything will not be good for anything. But it's not known what the content should be and how it should look like. So that's why big companies like Facebook, let's say, they established a studio called the Oculus Story Studio, where they hired filmmakers from Pixar and other animation film studios to get together and to experiment to tell stories in VR and to make something like the first VR films. And also other technology providers with the same background, like Jaunt is a big company looking at 360 cameras. They also have a creative arm, a story studio that showcases and experiments with short film clips, where they would learn and showcase also the storytelling side. So experiment with this new technology. They are not looking really at the drama side as this very classical type of art, very conservative maybe, but that's something that we as an academic institution, of course, can do. No?
It's interesting because you could see it going either way. You could see, I suppose, a concern by traditionalists, let's say in theater, so there's technology involved or complicating things. But you can also see it going the other way, and I think I've seen it go a bit more this other way, which is people actually very much appreciating the spotlight that some modern technologies are actually shining again on traditional approaches and methods, because it seems a bit different here. It's not that we have maybe competition between different forms of communication, but we have now collaboration more than before. Theatre seems to be more in than it's ever been before, and more appreciated and respected by researchers in this area. Have you found that? Or are there traditionalists who say, get out of here with the technology?
Well, my experience is not as broad to make a judgment about that, but I can imagine that's true, yeah.
But you've had a broadly favourable reception when you wander in with
so
technology.
With this one, we got a very good perception. And also we, as I said, so we are planning many more of such examples and trying out. And this was a very encouraging first step to follow that.
There just does seem to be something different about it. Much of the technology, and of course there's many variations of it, so I'm sure this isn't true across the board, but much of the technology seems to be interested in what traditional forms are doing and seek to kind of amplify it or shine a light on it rather than compete with it, just to take something from it and then leave it to the side. And it'll be interesting to see how that develops. And hopefully it'll develop very well, because the room for collaboration, like the project you're working on there, is massive. And it also addresses the content gap that you're talking about before. It seems that we don't need just die-hard technology people, as wonderful as they are, to be the only people involved in the creative projects that are happening. And I love that about what you described to begin with. You're talking about facilitating content creators. It seems that who a content creator is becoming even broader over time.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you see how creation and consumption of visual content changed over the last 5 years with YouTube and other things, where everyone is becoming a creator in that sense, or has the ability, at least to some extent, to express himself within borders, and also with the culture that evolved around that. Yeah, that YouTube creators are millionaires. Some people who are the big hype in this area, and with these technologies will offer additional opportunities for channels and to do things with that. No? And another thing, of course, how the big classical content companies see that really as a threat, right? That, classical film or television and these things don't work anymore. So I know that also very well from my past employment, that there's a lot of fear against these type of new technologies. No?
Let's go there, but let's rewind a little bit first if we can. Why are you doing this? What got you into this line of interest to begin with? If you go back, keep rewinding as many years as you need to, back to when you were young, when you were particularly young. If you look back now, was there evidence of these interests in your past, the way you spent your time, your own consumption of media, your own interests in the world? What do you see when you look back?
Yeah, I mean, so we can go as back as after I left school.
Go back as far as you want.
So, when I finished school, I was looking for something to study, and I tried a very, very different subjects that I didn't follow very much on, but I was always making music and had an affinity to music and expressing myself in playing in bands and these things. And then there was an opportunity of studying signal processing and audio engineering at Technical University in Berlin. And I thought, like, well, if I don't become a rock star, I'll at least be an audio engineer. So I started my research in that direction. But I always was very much interested in science and computers, and it was all quite new. So the first personal computers came out maybe at the same time. So I'm quite old already, as you can see. So I got really engaged in this study subject, and was always looking for things like signal processing, which is in the end the same as what I'm doing today. So that was the direction that I selected there, out of a mixture of a creative and a technical interest, which is, if you want, reflected today as well in my title, which is Professor of Creative Technologies. Right. So I had an understanding and affinity to the creative sides, but also an interest and the ability to solve technical and scientific problems. Right. And then, so how I came from audio to video was also a coincidence that there was a job announced in Berlin at the Research Institute, which was in image processing, not in audio processing, but it's basically the same math and science behind it. So I got a job. And I started my research and my PhD in video image processing, and then one came to the other, and I went on to the point where I'm here now today. You know?
And just taking, I'm conscious we should probably unpack a few keywords and terms as we go along for our broad listenership. Just signal processing even itself. What is signal processing?
Yeah, signal is let me say it very scientific first, a digital representation of a real world phenomenon. For instance, music, something that you can hear with your ears, can be represented as a mathematical function, as an electrical signal. And any type of processing of this signal, which is audio or which is speech, to then finally give it to a loudspeaker and hearing it, is audio signal processing. And everything that the camera does, from taking a picture, it converts it into a signal, and then in the end a display shows it to the audience. So everything that happens in between is signal processing. And well, you can think of speech as a signal or many other signals, but in the end it's a digital representation of phenomena, of media phenomena, if you want, also of perceptual phenomena. You can also think of it that way. And all the processing that any machine or computer can do around that's what I call signal processing, right?
So that was a good area to get into. That doesn't sound like it's going to go out of fashion anytime soon.
Yes.
Yeah, it's true. And representation, as we said, whether it's with the stick in the sand, or whether it's the you know, ink on parchment, or whether it's the digital versions of it you described, it does seem to be a kind of a universal theme. It was like that for me actually as well. That's why I got into psychology, because I was thinking, well, what's something I really am interested in, but that will always be relevant in some shape or form. You know, I won't be unemployed in 10 years time because that goes out of fashion. And I think, well, people are always going to be around, and the representation you describe, the storytelling we all do, that does seem to be a universal theme.
I also studied psychology for one semester.
Did you?
But
Sorry to hear that.
I didn't finish it. So
that's a common complaint.
Yeah.
It's like that in filmmaking. I remember reading a report once, I forget where it was, but I think they said that the majority of people who studied film ended up working in like agriculture or something like that, you know. And then of course a lot of the filmmakers didn't study it at all. They just went out there and did it. So it's not always that simple. Yeah. But on that point, there is very much a psychology to what you do. And I mean, as I say, even in that creative technologies title, there's a sense in which, you know, you could just get caught up in the technology, but I notice in any of your previous work as well I've looked at, you're always nodding to the overall storytelling, to the content creators, to the psychological elements to it. What is that like in your work in a day-to-day sense? Because some of the projects, and I know there's many of them that you've accomplished, are these technical feats where you're trying to solve problems and make things happen. And I can imagine in a day-to-day sense, it's very easy to be caught up in the minutiae of the math, essentially, of that problem and try to figure it out. How do you do that? Because you probably do need to focus in detail on one hand. How do you do that, but also keep the playful creativity as part of it and that overarching theme?
You know, what you describe is a phenomenon that's totally true. So many of the researchers in our field are focusing on the math, on that signal, what they have. But in the end, all of this is made for the end user. So the human factors and the quality for the end user is what matters finally. So and many of my fellow colleagues also recognize that. And I mean, in the area of signal processing, there's a field that is constantly growing and getting more and more important, is what we call quality of experience, which first tries to understand the perception of the human, so the audio and visual limitations of that, trying to understand what does quality constitute in these different categories, and then also in multimodal cases, and then trying to come up with technology that would measure, quantify, and influence these quality aspects.
Right.
And that's something that we very actively do. So we go specifically to such conferences on quality of multimedia experience and do some of our publications are on things like visual attention. So where we try to understand, given a couple of images, where do people look at, or what does call the attention? Specifically, one project we did was about 360 video, so virtual reality video, where the visual attention is different from looking at a photograph. So if you give someone a picture, you can there is science that could tell you probabilities of where people would look at. But in the moment when you put someone in a VR headset and they can look around, the story changes. So that's a research question that we were looking at. And this is a very important guiding principle in many of the research that we are doing. So understanding the perception, the limits of perception, and then designing the algorithms and the technical systems towards that. Right. So I had a couple of projects also in my last appointment, even a research focus that we called perceptual computing or computational perception, where we looked, for instance, at high dynamic range imaging and how are the limits of the human perception, and how do we have to manipulate images to adapt them to the dynamic range of the eye. Or we did a lot of research on stereoscopic 3D, as that was a big hype over the last 10 years maybe. But it's a very difficult perceptual phenomenon, and you can make very many things very wrong in stereoscopic 3D. Yes. So we were looking at specifically a couple of papers I have in a Journal of Applied Perception, where we studied such phenomena and tried to answer quality aspects or perception aspects of stereoscopic 3D. And so as example, so we always try to use the knowledge from perception for design of our algorithms, but sometimes we even measure the limits of perception with regard to some of the content that we are creating. Specifically in my research, that was a very strong focus.
So to do what you do well involves taking on quite a lot, doesn't it? Because you really are taking on the psychology and the technology of it in order to do justice. Because as you said, if you just work away on the technology and you make what you think is good technology, but if it doesn't work with the human at the end of the day, it's going to be a novelty, but it's not really going to be anything else. And in terms of your kind of day-to-day work, I suppose, your focus on user experience and conferences and conversations around that obviously emphasize that a huge amount. Is it that when you're working and you're focusing on the detail, is it that you kind of keep consciously coming back to that? In other words, are you imagining the end user as you're working on it?
Yes,
regularly?
Definitely. So I mean, practically in many of these projects we build some algorithms which takes a few weeks or months. We are developing something, optimizing them, but in the end, in order to justify if it is a good or bad invention, we have to do a user study. So often we then we make a very formal user tests where we invite 20 people and give them a task with something that we developed, and we have to be so it's like experiments in psychology, where you would clearly define tasks and objects, and then you do some kind of statistical analysis of of the data that you collected, and that is often the core justification and evaluation of the technology that we did. These type of experiments. And when we are developing the technology, well, then it is coding and math and that, but still it's always the end goal in many of those is the perception, and the goal to make some quality measure increase over what was done before, for instance.
I see. That itself, I think, is an interesting point, because one thing that we see, I suppose, in practice is that it's not always the most sophisticated technology or content that necessarily has the greatest effect. And I mean, even you have a Disney background, and it's not that, the higher the resolution or the more you can pump it up, necessarily the more the emotion is there. We all have our memories of fairly low quality, VHS cassettes, maybe from, years back, where you may be crying while watching them. And of course you can have, very, very high polygon kind of well rendered stuff that can be boring as well if it isn't done right. How do you think about that in your work?
I mean, it's a matter of parameters. So as I said, listening to a story on a bonfire can be as immersive as being in a virtual environment with the latest headset technology. So that's one thing. So the quality of the stories is one parameter, of course. And but in these tests that we are doing, we are trying to identify very narrow questions and really abstract, making the tests in a way clinical tests almost to abstract from everything that could influence besides that parameter that we are measuring. So for instance, if we are interested, the example you said, in the effect of resolution, we would show different resolutions and measure the effect, hopefully only of the resolution. But of course, as piece of a whole creative art, it may not matter because it's a story that matters. And if you see it on an old VHS and you get emotional, then that's what counts. No?
Would it be fair to say people get that in the main, in terms of the storytelling of different descriptions? Do you find, in other words, people who approach this and say we need to get the technology right and they're neglecting the story a little? Is that, or do people get the importance of the narrative first, do you find?
Yes, so definitely. But still, in our end, we don't want to get into the business of the creatives. So we still say we are making the technology as good as possible.
Right.
But that the creatives can do what they want to do, what as good as possible. They could still certainly do a good creative product with technology that is not less good, but that is not that good. But if they have it a bit better, that won't harm them. So in that sense, we try to, we abstract
You're creating, if I understand you, a high quality piano rather than trying to teach them how or what to play in that sense. So the tools are there, the quality is there. That's good and it's interesting because it's only by contrasting these different technologies that we can kind of see that more, the notion of the uncanny valley, the idea that yes, it can be a bit eerie at some points when we approach realism, and sometimes it can be safer in some ways to play it with very, very simple lines and things like that are somewhere between the campfire you described and then the really, really incredibly high fidelity immersive experience. I suppose it just keeps showing that we project, I suppose, so much at the time. We're constructing in any given moment our experience, and it's amazing how much just the imagination itself can do, which seems to be very, very good news from a narrative point of view, because it means you can have very high leverage sometimes, and it points back to narrative again. So the user testing that you're talking about there, to what degree is there either good psychology out there that you can use, or is it out there but maybe accessible to you, or do you really find that in practice you need to just go and test it yourself? In other words, is there any good psychological data that you'd find is actually accessible?
Yeah, so we have our standard textbooks specifically for the visual parts of visual perception that covers the basics to a good extent.
Okay.
But often these tests were made under certain conditions, and for instance, the contrast sensitivity function that is used a lot in a lot of technology implementations. That was measured at some point under certain conditions, but then you use it to some extent, but you have to adapt it to the conditions of the context where you're using it, and kind of retune parameters or refine something. So we build on knowledge, as much as possible as we can. But then sometimes we encounter problems that are emerging only from the fact of the technology, and then we use all of this background with all everything that we find from psychology books. So we cite the psychology books, and then we add something that is specific to the technology to that. An example of that was a work we did on stereoscopic window violations, very specific. So something that...
What is that?
It's an effect that can only occur in stereoscopic 3D because you are watching a three-dimensional thing on a 2D screen. And it is considered an artifact, a bad effect.
Okay.
So we were interested in quantifying and understanding this effect, which is something new and only in the context of stereoscopic projection, but it builds on perception and on three-dimensional perception of the human and the contrast, sensitivity, and all of this knowledge that is there has to be applied to build a model, a computational model now for this specific technical system. So that's how it can look like.
These types of difficulties, I presume, are kind of the equivalent of motion sickness with VR or that type of thing. Is it just there's a kind of a butting heads between the perception of it and the presentation itself?
So the motion sickness in stereo 3D is also the equivalent of motion sickness in VR. So that's one of these questions that people have been studying.
And the stereoscopic work you're talking about, how would you define that for somebody? They probably have experienced it, but maybe they don't know what that is. What actually is that? How is that defined?
I mean, stereoscopic perception is something we all, or most of us know from the 3D cinema, where you put glasses on and then you see something on the cinema screen or some other TV screen with some depth perception. But that's by no means a natural perception. That's actually a brute force fake of the human visual system. So you are projecting two different images into the eye. And if these two images are made carefully, you will perceive a stereoscopic effect, so seeing depth out of that. But as it is really nothing natural, as many people believe or would try to make the audiences believe, it's a very constructed, artificial signal, not to use that term again.
Sure.
And if you don't do it very carefully, you create a lot of bad effects.
Right. Yeah, I can see the room for that. And there must be such a learning in that, because as with most things, we understand them when they break. They're functioning and they're invisible in that sense. So I'm thinking, in the kind of work you're doing, you must be doing a lot of good psychology just by trying to push the limits, essentially, in terms of using certain technologies. You push it works. You push it a bit more, it doesn't work anymore. And you think, okay, we've learned something here about human perception, and then it shines back. And, it's interesting, because a lot of those questions, if you as a psychological project went out to ask those, it would be hard to test some of these things other than through the technology you're developing. So that seems to be that dance again between the psychology and the technology of it.
Yeah.
So in terms of, we probably should have done this earlier, but I think we had a good flow that I didn't want to break. But in terms of defining a few more things, we've talked about signal processing and we've talked about stereoscopics. We've also casually used the terms virtual reality, augmented reality, maybe mixed reality, which for many of our listeners is going to be just fine, and they're sick of hearing them defined. But I'm conscious there will be people listening to this who don't know exactly what we mean by that. They've probably gotten the gist of it. But more so than just, offer a link to a kind of some random description of it. I'm interested in your description of those terms. So feel free to bring in any terms you want here, but virtual reality, VR, augmented reality, AR, MR, mixed reality, or anything else. What are these terms to you?
Yes, so you're absolutely right that there's a lot of mixture and wrong understanding or different understanding of these terms. They often describe different things, not 100% correctly with the same term. So, but it all refers to, or it became popular recently, to the availability of head-mounted displays, so glasses-based systems where you put something like a headset in front of your eyes that also projects two different images into your eyes. But in that case, you don't see anything else. So you just see those images that are projected into your eye. And if you then project a scenery that is 360 all around you, you can create the illusion of being inside of the scenery that is displayed. So you don't have, when you turn around, the real world anymore. So you're completely immersed. And here is the term immersion, or one of the understandings of the term immersion also. You are put into the scenery. So that's what virtual reality should mean. So you put on a headset and you are inside a scenery. So now there are different flavors of that as well. So one thing that people may also know is 360 images, so where it's something that was captured with a camera, and you can look around, for instance, on some touristic place, and you feel like as if you are in that place. And also video versions of that. But then the other version of that is something more related to, if you think of games, so you put such a headset on and you are in a computer generated, in a virtual environment, and can walk around. And if you have a tracking system with that, you can also explore areas and walk inside a virtual environment. But I would say virtual reality altogether is widely understood as the consumption of some sort of media content via a head-mounted display. It can be either captured with cameras as 360 video, or it can be a full computer-generated environment. But it does not need to have to be via a headset, it can also be something that you explore on a computer. And so a computer game is in that sense also a virtual reality just displayed on a 2D screen. But mostly currently people are thinking of head-mounted displays and being immersed into that. But only seeing what you have through the display. So augmented reality as a contrast to that is really having something where you see your environment, but you have virtual elements integrated into that. So for instance, I have a glasses base that I can see through, but there's some kind of projection that also shows me some virtual element in that. So for instance, some location information or some type of graphics overlay to the scenery that I'm in. But that can also be referred to having a mobile phone with a camera that looks into a certain direction, and in this camera feed you have a virtual element integrated. So augmented reality always thinks of integrating the real and the virtual via a head-mounted display with see-through or via mobile devices. And this use case on having mobile devices and applications that put virtual elements on that, so that's something that will definitely in the next years be an enormous hype with. So people are projecting markets in the areas of hundreds of billions around that, because the use cases are just so wide and so incredible. So it's not, and I mean, we talked a lot about creative content, about theater, about the film, but most of that will not be in that area. So we are exploring it, and other people as well, but most things will be in different areas, like information systems, location-based systems, games. So one of the biggest and most important encounters of the general public with augmented reality was Pokemon Go, which was kind of, for many people, showing for the first time what you can do and how this connection of a virtual world that is still geolocated with virtual elements that can be overlaid into images with the actual natural world that you see, what kind of opportunities that brings.
And this is, again, I always like to think back to the traditional versions of any technology, like the cave paintings or the stick in the sand or any of these things. And it seems that, you know, today and for a very long time we've had signs in the world. There's traffic signs and the signposts and there's things like that. And you know, that of course already is a type of augmentation, isn't it? We have these symbols that represent something, and we might hold a map as we're walking around as well. It seems that we're just finding less clumsy ways of doing this in a way, isn't it? We're kind of, you know, richly mixing them together a little bit more. And also being able to customize and adapt as well. Because, you know, I think we've all had that experience of being in, say, a train station, and, you know, we're traveling maybe through a city and we're looking at the board and trying to find the one that's relevant for us. But of course, if that was the one that jumped out at us, how useful that would be. But it can't do that for everybody. But now maybe it can, isn't it? The technology can facilitate that. Absolutely. So it seems that we're getting more refined, I suppose, at using what are kind of traditional tools and techniques, but technology, again, is just making them that bit easier to access.
So that's one thing, that there will be a lot of such use cases of augmented reality where they just help us to have location-based information, personalized location-based information available everywhere all the time. And this connection between the real and the virtual world and the databases and AI behind that will be one very important class of applications, I would say.
Yeah, and we seem to be seeing, again, this just major convergence between so many technology, the idea of Internet of Things being tracked, and then data to begin with, and then augmentation and virtual reality. It makes
artificial intelligence navigates through that, and
it seems to make the smartphone seem like nothing when you think about it. But it was a very necessary part in enabling it. But it's only getting going in terms of things coming together and converging. How do you feel about that? Does it excite you? Does it scare you? Does it do both?
It does both at the same time, I must say. So it excites me really, as there is a lot of opportunity and a lot of good, but it's also it also has dangers. A lot of things that can go wrong there, because often in the past with technology we saw that the speed with and the excitement around the technology and the business opportunities will make it difficult to follow up with the reflections and the thinking of the dangers and the consequences of such technologies. So that's something that might be a bit dangerous here. But definitely, I mean, that Apple has announced that the next iOS will be, augmented reality will be available on basically every iPhone, and Google just did the same with Android. So within a few months, everyone will have an augmented reality capable computer in the pocket. And then now all the app developers will jump on that and exactly try to find out, what can I do now using this opportunity, and how can I create apps that would be interesting for users to have, right?
You used the YouTube content creation example earlier. What do you see happening with AR and VR? Do you see it being quite democratized in terms of the content creation too, or do you see it being a bit more specialized?
Well, I see it less as a creative content, but rather as something where more professional content and app or this type of navigation systems also will predominate, or maybe medical systems or many different things which are more about information and displaying information and connecting to information in the real world. So apps in that will be definitely coming. But for the creative content, creating augmented reality games or augmented reality clips, that's something that's not so easy yet, I would say. Yeah. But once it is better possible, I'd see it like what happened with YouTube, at least.
Yes, yeah. The expertise for a lot of these projects seems quite specialized. Like there might be, particular medical applications where somebody may have the medical experience but not the technical experience to, make what needs to be made, and then vice versa. Somebody's an amazing technical person, but they mightn't have a medical background or a legal background or a background in deep sea diving or, whatever the specialist area is that's needed. How do you think about the role of collaboration in what seems to be an increasingly very skill-specific area? Because, developing something technically is, requires very specific skills, and having those backgrounds is very specific. Do we have enough people that have both sets of skills in their interests, or do we just need to work together more? Or
not
how does
necessarily,
that work?
But I think it will be similar to what we see with... But you're right. So it requires technical knowledge and domain knowledge to make a good app, and you need both people on board in a startup or so, for instance, to make an app. But I think it will not be that different from what we see today with companies that build apps, where it will just be augmented reality apps that make use of augmented reality technology, but then finding the applications in these different domains, like all these hundreds and thousands of apps that we can access for our mobile phones today that address some specific society or business or creative need, and where these experts from these areas got together with the technology experts who built the apps to make them available.
Yeah, it's true, because the app culture, if you think back, some decades ago, to the idea of making a computer program, that would seem crazy. It's like, what are you going to do, design a spreadsheet or something? It is interesting how that culture has shifted over time, and now the bar, in a bad way sometimes too, but the bar for creating an app is certainly much lower than it was. But of course, that's very good in other ways. You can sometimes have low quality, but the point is you will have many more people at the table doing interesting things, more of a kind of an ecosystem and a kind of a natural selection, I suppose, of good apps to some degree, hopefully, if they're getting viewed, making their way to the forefront. The other thing I'm thinking about is the distinction between, back to the VR, I suppose, a little bit more, but the distinction between, sometimes made between immersion and presence. And it is interesting because you could have some object on the table somebody would see, and it would just remind them of a previous time. Maybe they saw the bottle, and they'd be in this deeply meditative, essentially immersed state where they're remembering that experience and experiencing it. And other times you could have lots of technology around them. Like they might be in a cave system, let's say, with this projection around them, and they may be thinking of, you know, what they're going to do later in the day, and then there could be something very small that could evoke presence in that moment. I know what you were saying earlier is that you tend to focus on, you know, specific technical challenges and create those tools for people. But of course, you've seen so many of these technologies, and you have an artistic and creative aspect yourself. Any kind of thoughts or guidance for content creators in terms of that distinction between immersion and presence? We could just throw technology at it. We could try and wrap people around and immerse them physically, but they mightn't be there in spirit.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I say. So a good movie, if you after 10 minutes still think you are in a movie, it's not a good movie. If you lost yourself and are in the movie, then it's a good movie. So this is something where the quality of the story, of course, plays a significant role. But also there are, if you think of these immersive systems, or as we call them, like VR or projection systems, there is quite a few projects that have been looking specifically into presence and co-presence and where does presence break, what are the conditions for presence. There's a quite wide body of research of people who have been looking at that, specifically in VR applications. I've been involved a little bit, so not too far into that, and I know that for instance, one example was then a large EU project where not only one partner was in, but a technology partner building the system, but also a psychology partner who would then design the tests and do some kind of presence studies about that. You know? And we've been in a project also called Action TV recently where we did something similar. You know? So we built a system where virtual and real participants would be together in a game show, and there was a TV studio involved. There was a couple of research institutions to build the technology, but there was also a human factors company that is fully specialized in human factors tests, and they run an exhaustive user study with the system and measured basically they were applied psychologists. They measured these things to answer these questions of presence. No? And I think luckily these questions are more and more understood, and the companies who make the technology have put more and more effort and resources on the design. So not only on the haptics and the design, but also on the human interface and onto understanding human interfaces and what makes them look good and what would create presence. So if we think of these immersive systems, I would assume that people are caring a lot about making that really as good as possible.
And it's a very, very existential question in many ways, because if you say, what is presence in virtual reality? You know, we have some sense that it means probably not seeing the equipment as equipment, that, you know, not thinking I'm wearing a head-mounted display right now. As you said, that's like your cinema example. If it feels like a film 10 minutes in, then it's not really having its desired effect. So it's something to do with not having an awareness of the technology. It's something to do with not being maybe in the cinema or having the head-mounted display on and maybe thinking about what you're going to do later that day. Probably that. We may say, well, it's something to do with attending to the media that's being presented to us. But then it gets a bit deeper, doesn't it? Because maybe by attending to that media, by following the narrative in VR or in cinema, that it's evoking something with us, which is actually bringing us somewhere else, a different point in our life, a memory or a sense of something in the future, which is taking us very far away from the technology, but the narrative is really achieving its desired effect. So it gets kind of tricky, doesn't it, at a certain point? And then when you start thinking about that same question in augmented reality, you say, what does presence in AR mean? You know, isn't it? And it's not quite that simple. It's something a little bit more... And I know in mindfulness has become more in, I suppose, in some of these research questions for obvious reasons. People are looking for answers. And, you know, a similar thing comes up with mindfulness. Are we, you know, does that really mean to just be fully aware of what's in front of you? In a sense, you can't be aware of what's in front of you except in a very, very boiled down way. Because, of course, to see a table is itself to be having memories of what tables are and what they do. We're always constructing in some way.
Go back to Plato. That question, of course.
It's a moving target, essentially, presence in some shape or form. So
I know about research that tries again to isolate factors, right, and say measure things like the resolution. So what is the minimum resolution to, in a statistical sense, not lose the immersion, right? So you can display things and then go down and find a statistical measure with test subjects and saying, well, your system should have at least XK resolution to guarantee some minimum level of probability for immersion. Right? So this is then how you nail down these questions and answer them kind of in terms of technical parameters.
And it seems to be about that narrowing it down, all right, isn't it? Creating ranges of certainly what we said already, our biological capability, at least to begin with. If you have something on a wavelength that the person can't see, that's off to a bad start, I suppose, to begin with. But then also psychologically, just understanding something, and this is where the storytelling, I suppose, comes in again, about just even the editing of something, isn't it? And the flow of it. And then back to the theatre point, if we don't have the editing, because it's a continuous experience, there still is editing in a sense, but it has to be what's happening in the scene, isn't it? To some degree, there still has to be kind of a flow and a pacing that's used. But it does, I suppose, very, very usefully, the technology does make us question a lot of things we already assumed. And that, for me, I remember when I first used a virtual reality headset properly, it was an early Oculus Rift, and far more nauseating than current versions. But what I found most interesting was not putting it on as much. That was really cool, but it was taking it off, you know, and kind of that reflection of, hold on a minute. What have I been doing before this? What have I been taking for granted? It does make you think about it.
I mean, we have obviously a demo system, and we have a lot of visitors coming through, and we show them, and many or some of them put on a Vive for the first time, and we kind of immerse them, we teleport them into this other state of mind, and then we observe often this effect when they take it down, that they need a moment, and we are very aware kind of being there at hand, and also kind of helping them, and in a nice way guiding them way back into the real world again, right? Because I mean, in a cinema this is also done, because if you go to a cinema, the light goes down first half, then you see the commercials, then it goes further down, so you are over a period of a couple of minutes, you are set into this mood of into the complete dark cinema.
Good point.
And also when you go out, you have the credits, and the light goes on with something, and then you walk out of the cinema. And I mean, if you realize this process of walking outside of the cinema is something that puts you back into reality to some extent.
There's an embodiment to it as well, isn't there, in that movement?
You're getting back into your embodiment is a good word. And then when you go out on the streets, and then you see the other people, and maybe you're in a city and lights, and then you realize. But you're not kind of switching it on from the cinema and us around on the streets.
But if it was a good film, when you go out on the street, even though you've acclimatized to some degree, you still though feel a little bit like Batman. Do you know what I mean? Isn't it? You're taking it with you to some degree as well. And that is actually what I wanted to ask you about next is the effects of these experiences. So this relates to, I suppose, the use cases for, you know, these types of immersive technologies. And education, of course, is a big one. Outside of just entertainment, education is a big one. Entertainment is probably the more obvious one. But something that's very close to my heart as well is therapy. And I like to use therapy, I suppose, as a word with a small t, not this very specific formalized version of psychological therapy in a room with a person, but more just therapeutic experiences that are uplifting and supportive in different ways. But in any case, what any of these use cases raise is the question of how these experiences affect us, essentially, whether we retain them, whether the learning that we do within them is really the same as what we might traditionally call real experience or not. So this is quite a big topic, of course, and you know we could go into massive detail about any part of that. But broadly, in thinking about that, the retained effects of these experiences and how the role they might play, what have you encountered there?
Well, everything that we experience changes us generally, no? So we are evolving constantly by everything that we do, and these things of course do that as well. So it's a difference if you try VR for the first time or if you do it a few times. And there's this learning effect, obviously, as well. So you get more familiar, you get more receptive for such things. It's, of course, also individually different. So some are more receptive, some really not. So we also experience that with our guests, that some are really keen on doing it, and some are really only hardly putting it and feel very, very scared of it. But definitely there is an effect. But as you mentioned, training, that's another question. So VR or VR applications have been used, I think, for many years already in professional training applications for in the military often, right? So where they would kind of train certain fight combat scenes and with the hope that they would be better prepared than in other ways. No? But it's a good question how far that correlates to the real experience, or how much of a percentage you can get out of VR, or what the parameters of good VR would have to be as close as possible to the real one, if the goal is to simulate a real experience. No? So that's a good question, and I can't answer that.
And it's I think you have substantially already, because it's more a topic of exploration really that we're all going to be focusing on over the coming decades, I suppose. Yeah. But I think we have some intuitions in it though already, and I think part of the problem seems to be is we're a little bit too casual sometimes in calling something virtual and something physical, isn't it, or real, and using those terms as if they were completely separate things. Because I think what stands out in what we're just discussing there is that there may be many real things you're doing in a virtual experience, and particularly when it comes to embodiment. I mean, if you're doing physiotherapy because you need to build muscle tone, and if the physiotherapist has one of those little steps that just has 2 or 3 steps and they don't lead anywhere, and you practice walking up and down those steps, in a sense this is a virtual staircase. It doesn't really bring you anywhere, but you're building muscle tone by doing it. So there may be certain senses in which in a virtual environment none of the other people are there or the other things are there, but if you're still moving in it, well, I mean, clearly that is real, isn't it? It's real movement, as real as anything else. There may be other senses in which, maybe more from an information learning point of view, where, let's say, it's just a simulation of a classroom with a professor speaking. You know, so actually being there and hearing that, or being in VR and seeing that, if there's no interaction anyway, it's going to be actually rather similar anyway in terms of what's being experienced. So I suppose there's always this sort of blending and mixing, isn't it, of the real and the virtual going on at different points. And that's, I think, what makes it such a rich and very complicated area to try and speak about simplistically.
It is complicated as well. One question that comes from that is also how do you embody yourself really well in a virtual reality set? Because how do you walk? No, because you typically have like things that you can make you teleport or go ahead. But that doesn't coincide with your perception of the motion.
Right.
Or if you have a moving camera, that can feel really, really bad. So there are a lot of such questions that are widely unresolved.
And at the moment, because, you know, embodiment is a word we've used now a couple of times, the danger, as I think we've said, is that we can make this just a very visual experience. We can make it a more immersive cinema, essentially, but we can miss the opportunity for that movement. And also interaction is another point, which isn't just about movement, but it certainly does relate to it. As it stands, as the technology stands, or as you see it developing, what do you think is the role of movement? Because, you know, you mentioned the HTC Vive headset, which, of course, Oculus have now done it as well, but it really, I suppose, more commercially pushed the barriers in terms of making it room scale, and now people are talking about warehouse scale, and there's more overlaying happening as well, more mixed reality where the physical and the virtual are being overlaid on top of each other. Work like The Void are doing, for example, with their Ghostbusters experience, where if you look at the set of what they have, they're really just these kind of white geometric shapes. But then when you put on your headset and you go in, that's actually something that's physical in the environment. You can touch it, but they've layered the virtual onto it in some way.
So all of these things are highly interesting and still under development. So that's an area or similar things that we are also looking at. So how do you combine the haptics and and then the visual part.
Yes.
Perfectly, right? Or one example I knew, for instance, was a theme park in the south of Germany where they used an old roller coaster, an old classical roller coaster experience, but they give the guests a headset. And on this headset, what they will see on Vive is a completely different environment. So they will go through a very futuristic experience.
Yeah.
But they will have the haptics and the motion of the real roller coaster. So, and both have to be, of course, perfectly synchronized.
Yes.
The motion of the ride curve is then also reflected in what you see. But that's one very concrete example of something like bringing the physical and the virtual world together and kind of trying to match them. But you can also imagine you can do very bad things if you kind of diverge the motion and you feel one thing and you see another thing. And a lot of these problems with a lot of technologies that we see, it was the same with stereoscopic 3D, is a mismatch of perceptual cues where you see something but feel something different. You see motion but you don't feel it. And the right technical tricks to overcome that and to make that match, that's an area that many people are looking at, like treadmills for walking or other type of things to combine the haptics or gloves.
I remember, I can't remember if I listened or read to it, but hearing about the developers who made that film came out about the guy who walked over the World Trade Center. If you remember that, on the tightrope he walked over, and they created a VR experience around that. So you go to the edge of the building and you'd look down, and pretty powerful stuff.
Yes.
And then you'd walk out over the rope. And, they were saying that they thought it was good, but then they said, well, hold on a moment, let's try something. So they went out and they got some rope, just regular rope, and they got some duct tape and they stuck it to the ground. And then they also got a regular cheap desk fan and they turned it on so the wind was blowing. And they said, now try it. It's like, wow.
Yes,
And isn't it strikes you that there's so many simple things that can be done, that feeling of the rope beneath the feet, the difference that would make, and the wind, just such simple things. But those opportunities are often readily available. And that's kind of exciting, I think, because hopefully there can be kind of cottage industries in this type of creative development that can really push the bounds. And it can be something like the YouTube example, which I'd like to think that, for the big companies that have the big budgets and the big resources, that rather than needing to get rid of them, because I think there's room for everybody at the table, that those interesting creative uses can really inspire other people to have the budgets then to push the boundaries even further. As somebody who, has experienced the big corporations, I suppose, and then the smaller developers and those creative endeavors, how do you see the role of each of them moving forward? We live in a very different world in terms of access to technology.
No, but I see it's exactly a world where there's so much opportunity for everyone, specifically in VR, AR. Because the big ones, they are making big investments and big bets. So to use the names, companies like Apple are buying like hell. Smaller companies in the AR space, they are hiring like hell. So I hear so many of my people I know are ending up somewhere there doing things. You see, Oculus was bought by Facebook for billions. Magic Leap is a company that has investments in the order of billions from Google and others. So all these big companies are heavily investing because they see this coming. So these markets of billions will come, and they will get, of course, the big share of the infrastructure, the platforms, of all of that. But still, to make all of this useful, they will need content as one thing. They will need apps as the other thing. So all of this, what makes these products useful, will create so much opportunity for content creators, for app developers, for specialized applications in all possible sectors. So I see also startups coming up everywhere in all possible directions, and a lot of interest from venture capitalists to invest in this type of startups. So it's a very, very hot area where there's opportunity for everyone, I would say. Which makes it, of course, difficult to get people as well.
Exactly.
And they all got offers from,
Well, that's good. It just puts pressure on you to make the projects you do that much more interesting than what everybody else is doing, isn't it? That's that kind of natural selection again.
we have our arguments as well.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Okay, so let's be futurists then for just a moment and try and look ahead. And if you think about maybe a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and hey, you can go 100 years if you feel like it. What do you see coming on the horizon? Because you're in a unique space that you're connecting with technologies and projects that are, that bit ahead of maybe what the average person is aware of at the moment. So that gives you a view of the horizon ahead, I suppose, that sometimes other people wouldn't have. And actually, when I said I was speaking to you, and I asked a few people, I said, what questions, do you think are most relevant? They said, about the future. What do you see coming? Yeah. That's actually what came up most. So a massissive topic, but yeah. What do you see coming?
So I have to put a big disclaimer first before I say anything to that question. No, but I can give you my educated opinion.
Sure.
Of course. No,
sure.
Well, if you ask for 1 year, I'm totally certain that we will see lots of AR applications coming up on the mobile phones.
Yeah.
So that's definitely coming. Or iPads. So maybe iPads will have a renaissance, or tabloids, because they will have a bit bigger screen, so you can. And I see that app developers will jump onto that when the platforms now provide the capabilities to do AR easily. So
yes.
AR Kit is something that Apple iPhone will provide.
Saw that,
and Google just released the equivalent for Android phones. So over the next year, we will see a massive wave of things coming up in that area. Many of that will be maybe also experimental and not survive, or not to the highest levels of usability and interest, but some of that will definitely come. So on mobile phones will be maybe a first wave of augmented reality. I mean, then definitely a next thing can be expected when maybe some glasses-based systems come out. So big manufacturers like Microsoft HoloLens also announced in a few years there will be like glasses out there, and there are rumors that Google also will provide a new version of the Google Glass, targeting consumer markets as well as all the others. So there are plenty of companies that are building helmets and other things. So we will see in a maybe couple of years more down the road also the use of glasses-based AR systems widely. As well as on the professional sector, I see a lot of this coming up in parallel to the consumer side, where also the constraints on budgets are maybe less important. So where people working in the field will use augmented reality for visualization of virtual data and integrate it with the real world. Communication will change through that. So this will really massively enter everyday life. And for the longer term, I see that, of course, the quality of these technologies will improve. It will go further and further. We will see maybe displays of holographic kinds, and where the boundaries between real and virtual really go further away. And in the longer term, I already formulated many years ago that the utmost goal of my research is to build the holodeck. So the full immersive entertainment platform, indistinguishable from reality, regarding all the senses and to the limits of all these senses, being fully interactive with the story and the environment and with each other. That's something maybe 50, maybe 100 years, certainly not in my life as a researcher. So I'm secured hopefully to have enough work.
Hopefully longevity research increases at the speed that this research does, and they'll meet each other somewhere in the middle. So good to see it.
Yeah. So ultimately that's something where I see it evolve. And
so this, I think you partially answered this anyway, maybe even the same answer, but I asked you what you expected. The other related question is, what would you like to see? So the holodeck, I'm guessing, is at least part of the answer to that question. But maybe in the short to medium term, what do you think would be a good focus to have? The world will do what it does. There's certain, financial interests that will, push certain projects more than others. But what do you think is a very good use for some of this technology?
Well, we have the luxury to some extent to look at the creative side, to work with, as we discussed, with drama people, and to look at the storytelling aspects and some of the artistic things, that would complement the more money-driven interests of companies, maybe.
Yeah.
So that's something that we will certainly continue to contribute as part of my current project, but also ongoing there, and to explore how these technologies can contribute to new aesthetics, new forms of expression, new forms of art. That would be something I'm interested in.
Very nice.
Right?
Very nice. And if you had any cautions about what could go wrong, maybe, if Terminator style, you were to send yourself from the future back to today with a little bit of a warning of what we should be careful with.
Yeah.
What should we be careful with?
Exactly what you say. So I also had once given a talk where I used images from the Matrix to ask that question. So let's assume all of this continues like that. Will we end up in the Matrix sometime? Will we only live in virtual environments? Will we get even more disconnected from the real world? The sci-fi of the Matrix or the Terminator is certainly a good picture for that, and I used that before as well. So that's certainly a danger that we can see. Not in the literal way, maybe, but components of that, right? So we already see that people are too much attached to their phones.
Well, this is it, isn't it? Yeah.
And that will get stronger and evolve even more. And people, I actually saw a very good short movie once where it talked about people who it was a fiction, but it showed people who got addict in virtual reality and basically lost the connection to the real life and behaved like junkies and only living in the virtual environment and totally neglecting themselves and being junkies who only could live in the virtual environment.
And that's a very important point, and I suppose one that we can flag, but we can't fully answer. We need to answer it in an active sense, as in a day-to-day, because that can happen with anything. It could happen with books. It could happen with virtual reality headsets. It could happen with gaming, with any information. And there does seem to be a difference. It's not that we need to have a moral panic and try and outlaw these things, but nor do we need to be addicted to them at the cost of holism. Yes. There does seem to be something in that where you can have these experiences. They give you something which you then bring back into the world, and you're a better person, and then you bring that creatively into the experience again. Or of course with the augmentation.
Is not the devil, and we shouldn't make it a devil, but we should flag the dangers and be aware and be educated to avoid them, and teach our children like I try. So
certainly
put that phone away and do something else, and
And hopefully with the augmentation as well, there's some opportunity there for them not always being so separate as well. So hopefully that will help too. That will be kind of a, if one is heroin, the other could be methadone, maybe step down in some way. Or, don't worry, you don't have to be lost in technology. There's technology everywhere. You can reconnect. So a last question before we begin to wrap up is, if you look at the bigger picture, if you go way back to the very beginning, even before signal processing of any description to the beginning, your love of music was there, let's say, but you hadn't formalized all of this, everything you've done over the decades that have followed. Is there any kind of key theme or learning that stands out for you from your work as a whole? You've worked different places, you've worked on many projects, you've worked with different technologies, you've encountered different people. Any kind of life learning or big themes that stand out for you that you think would be helpful to share?
Yeah, I mean, the more enthusiasm I could bring into some of the things I've been doing, the better it got in the end, right? So I mean, in work life, there you have different things to do. There are different duties. Some you like more, some you like less. But choosing something that you can really engage with and lose yourself in, then it's not work anymore. And then you just go for the enthusiasm and could work day and night just to get that thing done. Also, when the reward is not the thing that you are up for, but the actual doing of it, right? And that could have been something like making music or playing football or doing some of the research I did. But this total engagement and enthusiasm towards the thing was something that brought me the most in the end.
And did that happen by design or by chance for you? Because I know you said you focused on the music first, and maybe the signal processing seemed related to that. How should somebody go? Somebody maybe at the start of their career trying to find their level of interest. Yeah. Sometimes there's a divide. Society says, no, you do what you love in your spare time. You need to, develop some key skills. How to find that, do you think?
We are not living in the paradise, and you have to do things that make money and make a living in the end. And everyone has to do some choices here. But something like I sometimes call it educated intuition.
Wow.
I like this term. So
it's a nice term.
I actually told that to my daughter, kind of, because she was looking for a study subject just now. So she will start university and got 2 different options. And
right.
I told her exactly that question. What should I do, Daddy? There are all these options. I told her, well, look at everything. Try to be as rational as possible. Kind of, what are the criteria? How do you value them? But do this rather as a process of getting the education. But in the end, then the intuition is what will guide you, right? And you will not have all the options. So not everyone can be a rock star. I couldn't be a rock star, so I had to take a different route.
It depends on your definition. Academic.
I'm just an academic, but that is then was also an intuition. And I mean, over the years, I also tell her specifically, it will not be a direct line, and it was not in my case. So it will be, you have some idea, you start something, and the life will direct you and catapult you into different directions, and then you will see something new, and you will go for it, and then it will take you there. A lot depends also on coincidence and kind of casuality and whatever happens in life. But if you follow your intuition with a good background and education, then you're on a good track.
Wonderful. That's great advice. If people want to follow up on your work, stay in touch with what you're doing, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I mean, we have a good web page.
I'll put in some links,
The links, so vSense is the name of the project, and there is also contact formulas, and we also look at putting a lot of all our publicly available things on there. So the results of our research are on there. There's a nice trailer. There's also the team, so a good collection of everything that we do and the contacts to us.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
So the webpage is the best repository.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll put the links in. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, Professor Aljosa Smolic. I think it's very, very important to do this, not just because this is a fascinating conversation, but because I think a huge amount of your work is the kind of work that people will actually already have encountered, but not known that you're behind it. Number one, and number two, not even known that the work was done. Number two, because a lot of it is implicit. When a technology is well designed, when it works well, when those signals are processing well, you don't think of them as signals, like the point you made about the cinema. You just get lost in the experience. So I think talking about the rock star, the rock star on stage is very important, but so is the sound engineer, so are all the production team behind it. It really brings that together. So thank you for the work you've been doing, and it's been great having you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.